Good morning. Today I want to show how to build the most complex and feature-complete form that I could come up with. I called it the Ultimate Form Challenge, and it contains all the features that we, as developers, struggle with when working with forms. So first of all, as you can see, it's multi-step. It has 3 steps, and each step has some peculiar features implemented in it. So in this video we'll cover field validation and masking, normalizing fields, multi-step forms, dependent fields, for example when you want to show some field only if some other checkbox is checked, using the form with Material UI, uploading files, and uploading files using the dropzone package. All of this we'll implement using React hook form. So press a like button, share this video with your colleagues and friends, and let's go. So first step only validates the fields. First of all, it checks that the fields are not empty. If I use the tab to jump between the fields, it will highlight them and say that they are required fields. I'll enter my name and surname. Now, it also validates that the name doesn't contain numbers. If I enter the number and then tap to another field, it will show another error. First name should not contain numbers. And actually same for the last name. Last name should not contain numbers. So we fix that, and now we can go to the next step. The second step contains the dependent field. It only shows the phone if we check this checkbox. Here I need to enter an email, and then maybe optionally a phone number. And the phone number is masked or normalized in international phone number format. So if I start entering some Swedish phone number, +46 123 123 12. As you can see, it added spaces and formatted it properly. Now, let's go to the next step, and here I can drag and drop some files. For example, let's say I want to upload these 4 images. I drag and drop them, and they appear in this form. Now I can click Next, and here we see the results page. From this page you can actually start over and see that all the field values are preserved. First name, last name, email, phone number, and even the files. And if you like what you see, you can submit your form and see this success message. If we open the project, you'll see that I also have the uploads folder where all the data ends up being uploaded. Here we have the data.json containing the form fields, and I have all the 4 images I've tried to upload to the server. Now, if you're ready, let's start building this project. I'm going to begin by creating a new project using create React app, px create React app, the ultimate RHF form. After the project is generated, I'm going to go to this folder, the ultimate RHF form, and install the dependencies. Yarn, add, and then we'll need the React hook form to handle the forms. We'll need the React router DOM because we'll need the multi-step, and this will be implemented using the routes. React router DOM. We'll need Material UI core, Material UI icons. We'll also need the lib phone number JS library to normalize the phone number. Lib phone number JS. React dropzone to upload the files. Yup to validate the fields. Hook form resolvers to be able to use Yup with React hook form. React confetti for the confetti in the final step. And sweet alert 2 for this nice success pop-up in the end. Sweet alert 2. After the packages are installed, I'm going to open the project. Open the terminal, and I'm going to copy the server here. You will have it in the code example attached to this video. cp ultimate form completed server. You will also need to install a bunch of dev dependencies to be able to use this server script, and they will be included in the packages.json of the attached project. Install the dev dependencies by running the yarn script. And now I'm going to add 2 scripts to run the app and the server concurrently. First I'm going to add start server. It will just launch node server.js and also the dev script. It's going to run the concurrently, kill others to kill the previous running concurrently scripts. npm run start server and npm run start. Here you go. Now we can start working on our code. First I'm going to remove the file set that we're not going to use anyway. It's app.css, app.test.js, and log.svg. Then we go to app.js and we remove the imports and the layout. And instead we'll define the routing here. Import browser router as router, route, and switch from React router DOM. Now inside of the layout we define the router. Inside of it we use switch to only show one of the routes, the one that matches that with current URL. And inside of it we define 4 routes. Route number 1. Exact, because it's the first route and it's the root route. So we need to use the exact so it doesn't match with all the routes because all of them will contain the preceding slash. The component will be step 1. Don't worry about it yet, we'll define the steps later. Now we copy it, we don't need the exact with other routes. The second one will be step 2, step 3, and result. Components will be step 2, step 3, and result. Now let's define the step components. Create new file, step1.js, import React from React, export const step1 equals a component, and for now we'll just return null. Duplicate this file, create step2 with the component step2, step3, and result. Now, as you remember, we have this the ultimate form challenge header in the top of all the pages. Let's define this component first. Create new component, header.js. And actually, let's create a folder for the shared components that we'll use in this application. New folder, components. Move the header there. And inside of the header component, we import React. We'll also use the typography, import typography from material UI core typography. We'll need to import the make styles factory function from material UI core styles. Now let's define the component. Export const header equals a functional component that returns a typography with the text that the ultimate form challenge component should be h1. We want it to be the first level header element. And now we need to define the class names. To do this, we define the styles. Const use styles. It will be the hook generated using the make styles function. Here we pass the object with the field root. And here we'll define the styles for our header. Margin. Here we pass the function that accepts theme in the arguments. And we return an object. This is why we want to wrap it into another round brackets. And we need to define the field root with margin theme spacing 3, 0, 2. Those are just arbitrary numbers. I've just tried different ones and it looked better. Font family. We'll use the permanent marker. It's the font from Google Fonts and we'll add it to the project in a minute. Text align center, font size 40 pixels, color deep pink, text shadow 1 pixel, 1 pixel, dark magenta. Now we can get styles using the use styles hook, and then we apply a class name to our typography, styles root. Let's connect the permanent marker font. To do this, we'll need to go to index.css and in the beginning of this file, add this import statement with the URL that you can get from the Google Fonts when you select the font. Here we use the permanent marker font family. Now go back to app.js, wrap the whole layout into a fragment, add the header, and also import the steps and the result pages. Step 1 from step 1, step 2 from step 2, step 3 from step 3, and result from result. Let's open the browser to see if it works correctly. It looks nice, so let's continue. Now I'm gonna go to the first step and start implementing the form. First, we'll use the use form to get the register, handle submit, and errors. We define the onSubmit function. It's a function that will accept data. For now, we'll just navigate to the second step. We'll need the history object. We get it using the use history hook. History equals use history. And in onSubmit, we call history push step 2. Let's define the layout. Return, for now, div, inside of it, a header, h2, step 2, and the form with 2 inputs. Input, name, first name, type, text, placeholder, first name, and another one for the last name. We pass register as a ref equals register, and then we add a submit button in the bottom. Button type submit with text next. Alright, we now have the form. Let's make it look nice. To do this, we'll need to define a bunch more components. First, let's define the container. New file, main container. .js, import React from React, export const main container. Here we'll need to import the container from the material UI, import container from material UI core container, and the make styles factory function. Make styles from material UI core styles. Now in the layout, we return a container. We'll need to have children and other props. We pass the children through the container and pass all the other props to the container. This way it will still be configurable. Component will be main, max, width, XS. Now let's define the styles. Const use styles equals make styles. We pass the function with a theme that will return an object with the field root, with margin top theme spacing 4, display flex, flex direction column, and align items center. Now we get the styles in the component, const styles equals use styles. Then we pass the class name styles root, format the document, and we are done. Go to step 1 and instead of the outer div, use this main container. Next we need to define the form itself. Inside of the components folder, create a new file, form.js, import React from React, export const form equals a functional component. It also needs to process the children separately from other props. Here we return a form that will get the props. It will render the children. We also pass the no validate prop to it. And we also need to define the styles for it. Import make styles from material UI core styles. Const use styles equals make styles. Theme root is an object with width 100%, margin top, theme spacing 1. Now we get the styles equals use styles, and then we pass it as a class name. Class name equals styles root. Go to step 1 and now use the form component that we've just created. We're almost done. Let's define the input fields. Create a new component, input.js, import React from React, export const input. Inputs will need to handle the ref, so we use forward ref from React, so we need to import it as well. And now we'll get two arguments. First one is props, and second one is ref. Note that I'm not wrapping them into the curly brackets now because it's two separate arguments. I'm going to return a text field with variant outlined, margin normal, input ref that we get from the ref that we get through the arguments because we wrapped our component into the forward ref function, full width, and all the props that we get through the arguments. Format the document. And now let's go back to the step 1 and remake our inputs. We're going to use the input component that we've just created now. Don't forget to import it. Input from components input. Now we'll pass the label instead of placeholder, and same for the second argument. For the second component, it should be last name. For now, we're done with the inputs, so let's style the button. Create a new file, call it primary button.js. Import React from React, export const primary button is a component. We'll accept the children and other props. We'll need to import the button from material UI core button. We'll import make styles from material UI core styles. Now we'll define the styles. Const use styles equals make styles with the theme, and here we define the root. Don't forget to wrap everything into round brackets so that we'll return the object here with the field root and margin theme spacing 302. Now inside of our component we get the styles using the use styles and then return a button. Inside of it we'll render children and we'll pass the following props to it. Type submit, full width, variant, contained, color, primary, class name, styles, root, form of the document, and the last thing we'll pass is all the rest of the props. Go back to step 1, use our button, it's called primary button. We need to import it from the components primary button. Let's look at the form. We're almost there. We need to style the step heading and implement the form validation. To style the heading, we're going to use the typography, remove the h2, make the typography be the h2 component, and variant h5. It should look like h5, but actually be the h2 header. Let's call it step 1 and add the unicorn emoji. Make sure that you import the typography from material UI core typography. And now time to implement the form validation. We already have the errors that we get from the form, and to validate the inputs, we'll use UP. Import asterisk as UP from UP, and let's define a schema. Const schema equals UP object shape, and here we define the shape of our schema. So we have two fields, first name, which is UP string that matches with the regex. Here we define something that does not include the numerics. To do this, we use the following syntax, beginning and then end. In the middle, we have the group with not from 0 to 9. And if it matches with this regex, then the error will be first name should not contain numbers. And it should also be the required field. First name is a required field. Actually, same for the last name. Last name is a string. If it matches with something containing the numeric, it will say last name should not contain numbers, and last name is a required field. Now we need to use this schema to feed it to the useForm hook. To do this, we import the UP resolver from hookForm resolvers. Now in our useForm, we pass an options object with resolver that equals UP resolver with schema. Now we also define the mode. It will be on blur, which means that the validation will trigger when the inputs get unfocused or blurred. Now we go back to our layout, and here we'll need to pass a new prop called error, which is a boolean. So we cast errors and then our field name, in this case first name, to boolean using this double exclamation mark, and then we need to pass the helper text. Helper text errors. If it exists, then if first name also exists, then we pass the message. Here I use the optional chaining operators, so if any of the objects like errors or first name is undefined, then the whole construction will return undefined, instead of throwing the undefined doesn't have the field first name or the field message error. Format the document, and then we repeat the same for the last name input, but we change the fields. Last name, and here also last name. Let's make sure it works. So we try to enter 1 and then tab. Okay, we get the error, remove the 1, and we get the error on last name. Okay, good. I will try to enter my name, Maxim Ivanov. And as you can see, something is wrong. Let's check our regex. And I forgot the asterisk in the end, because we need to match all the other letters. Let's go back, try to input my name, and everything works. It means that we're done with the first step, but before we move to the next, we need to think how will we store the data between the steps. And to do this, you will need to use either a context or something like Redux or MobX to store the global state between the wizard form steps. Let's go back to the code and define a new component. We'll call it data context.js. We need to import React, of course, create context, use state, and use context from React. Now, first we define the context. Data context equals create context. We'll export the data provider, export const data provider. That is a component that accepts children and returns data context provider. It renders children, and we need to pass the value to it. We'll store the intermediate data in this context. You could use useReducer here, but I'm going to use a more simple solution that will work for us here. We'll just have the state data set data, and we'll use the use state with default value of empty object. I'm also going to provide the function set values. A function will accept the values as an argument, and then inside of it we'll call set data previous data, and we calculate the new value by spreading the previous value and merging it with the new values. The benefit of this simple method of storing any kind of data in this universal provider is that it's very simple and is very easy to implement. The downside is that every time you change any of the fields, the whole object is getting regenerated, so all the components that are subscribed to the data changes will be updated and re-rendered. It's not a concern for a small application, but you should think about it if you're going to use it in somewhat bigger code base. So if you're writing a bigger project, then I'd recommend to use something like Redux. And you will find an example of how to use React Hook Form to build wizard or multi-step forms with Redux in the video description. Now, we need to pass the values to the provider. Value equals data and set values. Format the document. And now we'll create a custom hook called useData to get the access to the data easier. Export const useData equals a function that is actually just a wrapper around use context where we pass data context to it. Now we need to go to the index.js and wrap our application into data provider. Import data provider from data context. Now we can go back to step 1 get the data and set values function from the useData hook. Const set values data equals useData. We'll need to import useData from the data context. And now we can do two things. First of all, we can provide the default values for our form. We do it by passing the default values option, where first name is data first name and last name is data last name. Also on submit, we can call the set values with the values from the form. Now we pass the onSubmit handler. It will be handle submit that we get from the use form that we'll use to wrap the onSubmit handler that we've defined here. Now we can go back to the browser, try to enter the valid values and press next. And we are now on the step number 2. Back to the code. So for the step number 2, we'll handle an email and an optional phone number, that the input that will be triggered with the checkbox if the person has a phone. So we'll start with the layout. We'll render the main container. Inside of it, we'll render a typography for the header with the unicorn sign and step 2. Then we'll render a form with an input with type email, label, email, name, email, and it's required. Let's define the hook form, const register, handle submit, watch, we'll need it later, and errors, from use form. We'll also need the history object, const history equals use history. And we'll need the data, const data set values equals use data. Now, when we use the form, we can already pass the default values. It will be an object with email, data email, has phone, this is our checkbox value. It will be data has phone, and phone number from data phone number. Mode, just like previous time, will be on blur. We will now watch the has phone value using the watch method that we got from the use form. Watch has phone. We'll pass the register as a ref to our input, ref register. Now let's define the checkbox that will enable the phone field. We'll render it using the form control label, with control being a checkbox and label being do you have phone, and we need to pass a bunch of arguments to the checkbox. First we pass the default value. It will be data has phone. Then we pass default checked. It will be data has phone as well. Color primary and input ref register. We also need to pass the name, which is has phone. This checkbox will update the value of the has phone field in the form, and now we can add a conditional rendering of the second input. Has phone and input with ref equals register, ID phone number, type tel, label phone number, and name phone number. Format the document. And now let's go and define the UP schema. Import asterisk as UP from UP. Const schema equals UP object, shape, and we pass the object there. We'll validate only the email here. Email, UP, string, email. If it's not an email, then email should have correct format, will be the error message, and it's also required, and it will say email is a required field. Now we need to import the UP resolver, import resolver from hook form resolvers. Now we pass the resolver to our hook form with UP resolver with the schema. we can define the onSubmit function, const onSubmit, and it will be the same as in previous step. It receives the data, and inside of this function, we're gonna call history, push, we need to go to step 3, and also we set values from the form. Let's make sure that we pass the onSubmit handler. It should be handle submit that we use to wrap our onSubmit function. Let's go to the browser. Let's check if we can enter an email. Let's see if we can toggle the phone number. Seems like everything works. Let's add the error handling to our email input. Error, which is a Boolean flag, should be exclamation mark, errors, email, and helper text should be errors, email, message. Let's check if it will show us an error if we enter invalid email. It shows it, and we can continue. Let's add a submit button, primary button with text next. Now we're going to normalize or mask the phone number so it's formatted correctly in international phone number format. To do this, we add an onChange handler to our phone input. It will be a function that will get an event, and inside of it, it will set the event target value to be the result of the normalize phone number function, where we pass the event target value. So we will process the event target value, change it, format it properly, and then it pass it back to that target value. We need to define the normalize phone number function now. Scroll up and define a new function, const normalize phone number. It's a function that gets the value, and inside of it we get the new phone number using the parse phone number from string, and we pass value to it. We get this parse phone number from string from the lib phone number.js. Parse phone number from string from lib phone number.js. Now, if we don't have the phone number, so the parse phone number from string could not parse it as a phone number, if no phone number, then we just return the value. Just keep it unchanged. Otherwise, we return phone number, format, international. Let's go to the browser, try to enter the phone number, plus 46, for example, 123, 123, 1. Okay, and it's formatted. We can enter the email, valid email, and then press next. We are on the step 3, and here we'll need to handle the file uploads using the dropzone. Let's go to step 3 and start filling in the layout. Here we'll again use the main container. We'll pass typography to it. Actually, I'm going to copy it from the step 2. Go to step 3, pass the typography, change the title to step 3. Don't forget to import the main container from components main container, and import the typography from material UI core typography. Now we'll define the form itself, and we'll import it from components form. Inside of it we'll have the file input. We'll define it a bit later. Name, files, control. What is this control prop? Just like register, you can also get the control property from use form, and you use it when you use controlled inputs. For now, let's just get it from the use form, and then I will show you how we'll use this control property that we pass to the file input that we'll create in a minute. Const control handle equals use form. We'll also need history equals use history. Let's import use form from React hook form, and let's import history from React router DOM. We'll also need the data from the context. Const data set values equals use data. Now we can use this data to pass the default values from the form. It works with the files as well. So we pass the default values with files, data, files. Let's also define the handle submit. Const on submit equals a function that receives data, and internally it calls history push result and also sets values to data. We pass it to on submit prop of our form wrapped into handle submit. And we'll also use the primary button with text next. I forgot to add the component h2 to the typography and variant h5. We'll also need to fix the use history import and also import the primary button from components primary button. Now let's deal with this control from the use form. You use this property with the control inputs where you need to manually handle the on change events, on blur, on focus, etc. So let's define the file input. Go to components, new file, file input.js. Here we'll deal with the dropzone. Import React from React. Export const file input equals control name, that's the props that we need here, and then we return the layout. First of all, we'll use the controller from React hook form, so let's import it. Import controller from React hook form. That's a special component that allows you to wrap the input that you need to control manually if you cannot just pass the ref to it. Usually it happens with components, with custom components like dropzone or some material UI components or some other custom components that don't provide the ref API. We'll need to pass the control to it through the control prop. We also pass the name from the name property. Default value will be an empty array. We don't need the closing controller, and we need to pass the render instead. Render is a function, so controller is actually an implementation of the render props pattern. So we need to pass a function there that will accept on change, on blur, and values, and the value. And we return a fragment inside of which we render the dropzone. There are two ways to use dropzone. You can use the hook or you can use the component. In my case, it's more compact and easier to implement using the dropzone component. We'll need to pass the onDrop handler, so we know when we actually drop the files into the dropzone. And we actually just pass the onChange from the controller. So when the dropzone will accept the files, it will trigger the onDrop function, the callback, and it will trigger the onChange on the controller. So React hook form will know that the file input was updated. On drop, we pass the onChange. The dropzone is also a render props implementation, so we need to pass the function there that will render our dropzone component, the visual representation of dropzone component, and this render prop function receives two functions: get root props and get input props. So here we'll render the paper from the material UI, variant outlined, and then we pass all the root props, get root props. Inside of this paper, we will render a cloud upload. It's an icon. We need to import it from the material UI icons. Import cloud upload from material UI icons cloud upload. We also insert an input. We pass the get input props to it. Get input props. And also we pass the name, because it needs to match the name on the controller, and the onBlur handler that we get from the controller. So we know, or React hook form should know, when we unfocus the input. OnBlur equals onBlur. And we also need to render the message for the user, because the input will be invisible. So we'll render a paragraph saying drag and drop files here, or click to select files. Below the dropzone, and this is why we were wrapping everything into a fragment, we render the list from React hook form, inside of which we will map through the value, which in our case is a list of files that we drop to our dropzone. So we do value map We pass a function to it. F will be our file and index will be the index. We render the list item, which we also need to import. We render the list item icon, and we render the insert drive file that we import from material UI, icons, insert drive file. Below the file icon, we'll render the text. Inside of the list item text, primary will be the file name, and secondary will be the file size. We're almost done. We can format the document. And now we can provide the styles for this component. We're going to define the use styles equals make styles. We pass an object there with root element and with an icon, styles for the icon. So the root element or the wrapper of our drop zone, the paper, should have background color. I think that EEE will look nice, like the light gray. Text align should be center. Cursor should be pointer. Text color should be 333, a darker kind of gray. Padding should be 10 pixels and margin top should be 20 pixels. The icon should have margin top 16 pixels, color 888, and font size, it will affect the icon size actually, 42 pixels. Make sure that you import the make styles from material UI core styles. Then inside of the file input component we get the styles, const styles equals use styles. And then we pass the styles to the paper, class name equals styles root, and to the icon, class name styles icon. Make sure to provide the key to the list items. We cannot guarantee that the files won't have the same name, so we pass the index here, which is suboptimal, but well, it needs to be unique. Now we can go to step 3 and import our file input from components, file input. Now we open the browser, click on this drop zone area, pick some file, for example one of the thumbnails of my previous videos, and then you can see that it appeared in the files list. Cool, that means that we can go to the last step. We're now on the results page. Go back to the code, open the result, and let's start with the layout. So just like on previous pages, we return the main container that we wrap around the typography. We pass the component, that should be h2, the variant, h5. We specify the form values header. Now below that we'll render the table of all the form values. Table container, component, paper. We need a closing tag. Inside of it we render that table. Inside of it we render the table head. And inside of it we render the table row. And inside of it we render 2 table cells. Table cell number 1, it will say field. And table cell number 2, value. Table cell number 2 should have align right. Now we render the table body below the table head. Table body. Inside of it we render the mapping function that will do through the entries, and we'll get the entries from the data. So let's define the data. Const data equals use data. To get the entries, and we only need the form fields, not the files, we'll do the following. Const entries equals object entries from data. We filter only the entries where the entry key, which is the first item in the entries array. Entries are basically arrays of 2 items. First one is the key of the field and second one is the value. Is not equal files. So we filter everything but regular fields. And it's good to also save the files. Files equals and data. Now we can go to table body and map through the entries, entries map, where we get an entry, and then we return a table row, inside of which we render a table cell with text of the entry key, which is entry 0. And another table cell with the entry 1, the value, that we will cast to string. Here we'll need to have another round bracket, and we will use the entry key as the key for our table rows. Entry 0. This is how we render the form fields. We can format the document, and now below the first table container, if we have files, Then we render a fragment with another typography, component h2, variant h5. We render the files title here, and then we also render a list. There we'll map through the files map. We pass a callback function that will get the current file and its index, and then internally it will render the list item key that will equal index, and inside of it will render the list item icon with the insert drive file. Let's import the insert drive file icon. Import insert drive file from material UI icons insert drive file. And then below the icon we render the list item text with primary text that equals f name and secondary that equals f size, just like in the file input. And then below that we render the primary button with text submit and with an on-click handler that is on submit. We'll define it in a second, and now we also render a link from React Router DOM that says start over and actually leads us to the root route. Now we have all the layout. Let's define the onSubmit. This function should actually post the data to our server. So first of all, this function should be async because we are going to use the fetch method here, and it's based on promises, and it's easier and better to use the async syntax there because it's easier to read. We'll need to define the form data because we will need to send the files along with the regular form values. And to do this, you need to send the multi-part form data, and it's easier to do using the form data object. Const form data equals new form data. If we have files, if data files, then we call data files for each, and for each file we append the file to the files field, file name. Passing the file name is optional, you don't really need to do this. And then we map through the entries. For each entry we do the same. We call form data append entry 0, so the form field will be the name of the key, and form field value will be entry 1. So the value of the entry. Then after we got the form data filled with the values, we can get the response object calling the await fetch http localhost 4000. The server is listening on the root route. We pass the options object. Method should be post, and body is form data. As we are posting the form data, the fetch method will actually determine that the header should be multi-part form data. And then after we got the response, we check if response status is 200. If we didn't get an error, then everything went smoothly. We can use the suite alerts that we need to import. Import swal from suite alert 2. And we're gonna call the swal fire. Great job, you've passed the challenge. And success icon. And also we'll need to show the confetti, and it's using the confetti components from the React confetti. So we define the state const success set success equals use state, and by default it's false. Then after we fire the suite alert, we call set success true. Now if success is true, then we render confetti. Let's format the document. And now we go to the browser and we'll try to submit the empty values. Submit, and we got response 200. Good. One last thing to do is to add some nicer styles to it. So let's define the use styles hook equals make styles. We'll need to import them. Import make styles from material UI core styles. Inside of this object, we'll define the root style that will be margin bottom 30 pixels, and the table margin bottom also 30 pixels. Now we can get the styles. Styles equals use styles. Scroll down to table container, class name equals styles root, and the table has class name styles table. Let's go to the browser and try all together now. Name Maxim, surname Ivanov, next, email test.com. Do I have phone number? Yes. +46 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, it's formatted. Next, let's select the drag and drop, select the file. Actually, we can select a few files. Let's select 3 of my previous thumbnails, open. Next, we have all this in the results page. Press submit, and we're done. Now, if you go to the code, you'll see that we have an uploads folder with the data that we sent to the server, and the thumbnails that we've sent along with it. Thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments if I didn't cover any of the features that you struggle when working with forms, or if you have any questions regarding this video. Subscribe to the channel and join my Discord server to pick the topics for the next videos. See you next time.